Rhetoric. It was at the foundation of Greek democracy and the Roman courts. It was at the heart of education in the ancient world. Even Plato kind of came around to the idea that it was a useful tool in the search for truth. But what do you do when your republic becomes an empire and that empire crumbles, and then what's left doesn't leave a lot of room for public debate? Well, that's the situation Patricia Bizzell and Bruce Herzberg describe as the Roman Empire dissolved into medieval Europe. In the first 4 centuries of the Common Era, Roman society under the emperors was increasingly torn by conflict. Dynastic succession was far from certain, since a successful general could and often did usurp the throne. Rulers were despots. There were no public deliberations on national policy, and even in the law courts, one had to be circumspect when treating private cases. Political oppression increasingly confined rhetoric to the study of style and to the declamatory rhetoric of the second sophistic. Now, it's obviously not totally fair to call those centuries following the fall of Rome the Dark Ages, but at least as far as rhetoric was concerned, they kind of were. But rhetoric didn't disappear completely, so today, let's take a look at its history in medieval Europe. And I know I just basically said it was rhetoric's dark age, but there's still some good stuff to talk about, so let's do it.
What can I say? You sell it so well.
Don't I? Well, let's get on with the show.
It was a good time for alchemy, though. Not that that matters to anyone here.
George A. Kennedy explains, beginning in the 5th century in the West and in the 6th century in the East, there was a deterioration of the conditions of civic life that had created and sustained the study and uses of rhetoric throughout antiquity in courts of law and deliberative assemblies. Schools of rhetoric continued to exist, more in the East than in the West, but they were fewer and were only partially replaced by study of rhetoric in some monasteries, though the functions of the study of rhetoric in the church were transferred from preparation for public address in law courts and assemblies to knowledge useful in interpreting the Bible, in preaching, and in ecclesiastical disputation. So, while early Christians undeniably made use of rhetoric in their debates about the nature of the church and Christian theology, some of them weren't so sure that rhetoric was something that Christians should be doing. Or, more precisely, rhetoric was so closely associated with the culture and religion of the declining Roman Empire that early Christians made an effort to distance themselves from it. Learning rhetoric would mean learning it from Roman texts, and those texts were often at odds with Christian ideals. As Bizzell and Herzberg put it, not only was there no Christian content in Latin literature, but its subject matter was frequently downright salacious. It often bespoke a world weariness and moral relativism that Christians abhorred. In fact, Jerome, of Bible translating fame, was particularly conflicted about his Roman education and his fondness for the writings of Cicero. As the story goes, if he tried to read the Hebrew prophets, their style revolted him. He became ill, and preparations were made for his funeral. He dreamed he was in heaven before the judgment seat, being examined about the condition of his soul. In reply to his claim that he was a Christian, the judge replied, "You lie. You are a Ciceronian, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Jerome promised to mend his ways, but, as Kennedy notes, it is doubtful if he kept the promise strictly. So poor Jerome was, apparently, worried about being more Ciceronian than Christian, and he wasn't the only one at the time. Which brings us to Augustine, who was a teacher of rhetoric before he converted to Christianity and eventually became a bishop in Hippo at the turn of the 5th century. And as always, the goal here is not to get into the weeds of political and religious history. There are much better sources than me for that stuff. We're here to talk about the rhetoric of it all, and there are still better sources than me for that, but hopefully just not as many.
Keep hoping, bud.
The point is that Augustine wrote a volume called On Christian Teaching, in which he essentially outlines a Christian approach to rhetoric, making a case for its value even in the church. As he says, any statements by those who are called philosophers, especially the Platonists, which happen to be true and consistent with our faith, should not cause alarm, but be claimed for our own use. In other words, don't reject rhetoric just because it comes from a source you find objectionable. Instead, learn what you can and take advantage of the useful gems that are there to be had. To a modern audience, we could maybe say the reverse. Even if you're not interested in Christianity, there's still a lot of useful rhetorical advice to be gained from Augustine. And a lot of Augustine's basic approach will sound familiar if you know about classical rhetoric. He talks about how different kinds of style can serve different purposes, a plain style for teaching, mixed style for pleasing, and a grand style for moving a listener. He talks about the complexities of understanding texts and language, and he wrestles with the fact that rhetoric can be used to advance falsehoods as much as the truth. As he puts it, since rhetoric is used to give conviction to both truth and falsehood, who could dare to maintain that truth, which depends on us for its defense, should stand unarmed in the fight against falsehood? And just compare that to Aristotle's statement in the Rhetoric. It is absurd to hold that a man ought to be ashamed of being unable to defend himself with his limbs, but not of being unable to defend himself with speech and reason. So Augustine had a good rhetorical foundation, but it's important to point out that Augustine's rhetoric didn't work the same way as the rhetoric of Greece or Rome. In those earlier contexts, rhetoric could be a tool for establishing truth, but as we noted in those videos, not absolute truth, but plausible, contingent truth. Rhetoric solved the problems of how to decide on the best policy in a democracy, or how to determine what really happened on the night of a crime in court. But the Christian Augustine wasn't interested in rhetoric as a truth-seeking tool, because as far as he could tell, he had the truth, and it was called the Bible. On Christian teaching, then, spends most of its length discussing methods for understanding and interpreting biblical texts, and then it presents a rhetorical framework for presenting the truths in those texts in effective ways. In Augustine's words, the more we are attracted by sweetness, the easier it is for medicine to do its healing work. So there are men of the church who have interpreted God's eloquent utterances, not only with wisdom, but with eloquence as well. Augustine explains that the purpose of rhetoric is to make truth clear, and his approach to rhetoric aims to equip teachers to engage congregants so they will actually pay attention and be moved by church teachings. When the source of truth in a given situation takes the form of "Thus saith the Lord," instead of a debate between lawyers, well, there's not much for rhetoric to do than to help you dress up your sermon so it won't put people to sleep. Although, of course, that's probably an overly tidy approach, and while it does look like early Christians sidelined rhetoric, Kennedy argues that the Abrahamic religions are inherently more rhetorical than classical paganism ever was, given their emphasis on sacred texts and speech. Which is all just to say that Augustine's approach to Christian rhetoric may be a form of rhetoric that isn't operating at full power, but we can be glad that he kept rhetoric alive, and we can be even gladder that his was not the final word on the issue, so stay tuned. But speaking of keeping rhetoric alive, Bizel and Herzberg also include a shout out to St. Patrick, yes, that St. Patrick, in their discussion of medieval rhetoric. As they say, the best scholars of classical learning in Europe were Irish monks. The man who would become St. Patrick and his followers brought the Latin language and classical learning to Ireland, where monasteries soon flourished and promoted the study and preservation of classical texts. Access to those classical texts was controlled and in some cases even forgotten. But the point remains, for all their resistance to rhetoric, early Christians also did a lot to preserve classical rhetorical knowledge, much of which could have been otherwise lost, and guidebooks on preaching were among the most prominent ways that rhetoric was perpetuated during the period. But if our journey through medieval rhetoric is an alphabetical one, let's move from Augustine to everyone's favorite, Boethius. Boethius wrote the medieval book on rhetoric, so to speak, and Bizel and Herzberg note that his treatment of rhetoric was often used alone as a textbook in the medieval university. And now that might sound like a good thing, but Boethius was not the champion of rhetoric that Cicero or Isocrates were. Where the Rhetorica ad Herennium, which Boethius closely followed in his own work, is a lengthy and detailed guide to practicing rhetoric in the Roman court, full of examples and practical advice, an overview of the structure of rhetoric, which Boethius wrote, is only a few pages long and presents the barest outline of classical rhetoric. Towards the end, he summarizes his own text, which is almost less of a summary than just a full-length repetition of it. He says, in summary then, the faculty of rhetoric is a genus of which the species are judicial, demonstrative, and deliberative. The subject matter is any question of civil importance called a case. The parts of rhetoric are invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. The tool used is the oration, and the parts of the tool are the exordium, the narration, the division, the proof, the refutation, the peroration. The function of the oration is to teach and to move. The practitioner is the orator. His duty is to speak well, and his goal is to have spoken well and to persuade. And I'm probably being unfair, but it just feels to me like Boethius is almost holding his nose and getting through it. But it's not just me. Bazell and Herzberg cite James J. Murphy in saying, it seems that Boethius wishes only to account for rhetoric, not to explore it, to place it in an intellectual system hierarchically dominated by dialectic. You might remember the early debates, preserved in the work of Plato, centered on the relationship between dialectic, which was a method of back-and-forth questioning that Socrates argued was a means for discovering absolute truth, and rhetoric, which Socrates argued was a dangerous counterfeit of dialectic. Aristotle created space for rhetoric to be its own thing, not a corruption of philosophical dialectic, but a distinct art of persuasion. But with Boethius, we return to rhetoric as a subordinate to dialectic. As Kennedy explains it, 1,000 years separated Boethius from Socrates' discussions with Gorgias and Phaedrus on the nature of rhetoric. Those 1,000 years had seen the formulation, development, and impoverishment of the classical system of civic rhetoric. Boethius, at the end of antiquity, again asks and suggests answers to fundamental questions about the nature of rhetoric. His answers were accepted by medieval scholars. As noted before, the work of Boethius was adopted as the text for teaching rhetoric at the University of Paris in 1215, and Kennedy observes that the role of rhetoric in public wouldn't be seriously re-examined until the 15th century. So, between the church making rhetoric a subordinate to biblical truth and the university making rhetoric a subordinate to dialectical truth, medieval Europe was not the time or place for big developments in rhetorical thought.
Wow, this is a great video. We've sat through this much just to learn that there isn't much to learn. And to think I climbed out of the bottom of the sea just to get to experience all this in real time.
Well, hey, maybe we could wrap it up with a little lightning round. What do you say?
Do we have to?
Have to? No, we get to. One place that rhetoric showed up in practice during the period was in letter writing, which, as Bazell and Herzberg write, took on significant legal and political functions as the Roman Empire declined and illiterate rulers came to control most of Europe. As a result, guides for writing letters were published across Europe, like the anonymous treatise The Principles of Letter Writing from the 1100s, which contained such dazzling flashes of rhetorical insight as this. An epistle or letter, then, is a suitable arrangement of words set forth to express the intended meaning of its sender. Or in other words, a letter is a discourse composed of coherent yet distinct parts signifying fully the sentiments of its sender. That's pretty good, and along with all kinds of advice and examples for addressing letters to popes and monks, close friends, secular lords, parents, and more. But actually, I do kind of like this one. More students should write more letters to their teachers that begin like this. To so-and-so, by divine grace resplendent in Ciceronian charm. I mean, I wouldn't mind getting a message with a salutation like that. But anyway, like other medieval rhetorics, letter-writing guides were more focused on style and maybe arrangement. The full range of rhetorical applications just aren't present. But there's more. There were also guides for writing poetry, like Geoffrey of Vinsauff's Poetria Nova, which was less limited to just style than other texts from the period, but still gave a lot of attention to tropes and figures, usually pulled from the Rhetorica ad Herennium. Geoffrey writes, "Let the beginning of your poem, as if it were a courteous servant, welcome in the subject matter. Let the middle, as if it were a conscientious host, graciously provide it hospitality. Let the ending, as if it were a herald announcing the conclusion of a race, dismiss it with due respect. In each section, let everything in its own way do honor to the poem. Neither let anything in any section sink or in any way suffer eclipse." He then goes on to discuss various different kinds of figurative language, metaphor, hyperbole, apostrophe, and so on, before arriving at some advice that actually does sound pretty rhetorical. Use good judgment. It is permitted to you to innovate in all things, being one greater in this than other men, yet still be, in your words, one man among others. Be not exclusive, but rather social in your eloquence. When you teach a craft, let your speech be that native to the craft. Every craft delights in its own vocabulary. But let the craft's words be content with the craft's boundaries. When you come outside into the common forum, let the craft be satisfied to use common terms. In its own house, a speech may be its own man. In public, let it suit the public. That's some good audience awareness, and good advice for more than just talking about poetry, I think. But anyway, that's probably enough medieval fun for one day. The simple fact is that while present, rhetoric did not have the same prominent place in education or society that it had enjoyed in the classical world, So there's just not as much to say about medieval rhetoric.
He says 73 hours into talking about it without coming up for air.
Oh, it hasn't been that long.
Well, it sure feels like it, though.
That's fair. The good news, though, is that even though rhetoric was subordinated to the authority of the church, the academic philosopher, and the illiterate king, it wasn't totally abandoned or forgotten in medieval Europe. So it waited for that opportune moment when it would come back onto the scene in the Renaissance, which is where we'll be going the next time we pick up the story of rhetoric. So look forward to that and to the present-day rhetorical fun we'll have on the show until then, and we'll meet again soon.